Let me kick it off because collective effervescence, this is a term that comes to us from the French sociologist Émile Durkheim. He's pretty famous for his thought on how society transitioned from mechanical society controlled by the seasons, everyone would go and work in the field, into what he then called an organic society where there's specialization of trades. Society is held together because everybody pretty much needs everybody else doing their specialized role. Modernity allowed for all this differentiation of trades, of roles, job roles in society. But if you imagine people had a religious ceremony like Catholic Mass, the singing, a ceremony, but also for him, tribal things like a tribal ritual where there's song and dance and it bonds the people together, he called that collective effervescence. And if you imagine now, say you go to university and you have Freshers Week, new students go out and they drink a lot of alcohol and throw up on each other and dance to pounding, pounding techno music. Well, he would describe that as collective effervescence. So, with that thought in the back of our minds, this signature restlessness contains the essence of Leibniz's Mannerism. Every time we are confronted with moments of undecidability, the integrity of our bodies and souls is at stake. At the same time, there opens up the possibility for trans-individual experiences and sur-existential transformations. After all, only what remains indeterminate in us enables us to communicate with otherness. Instability puts us in mutual implication in becoming. It is precisely in the indifference between one's own body and that of another that another type of relation beyond monads comes into view. One not based on domination, but on a minor use, a non-instrumental use of the body as a means without end, in which the potentiality of the body is not exhausted in the actuality of the soul, and other consistencies become possible. Both Deleuze and Agamben give the example of masochism, the neutralization of the juridical order through parodical exaggerations. Of course, it matters still whether one is a master or a slave, but what changes is that masters and slaves now become integral parts of something that exceeds them and potentially modifies their composition according to a new capacity to affect and be affected. This becomes clear in the extreme case of the liturgy of the Eucharist, which concerns a substantial transformation that is both modal and real. If there is neither metempsychosis from one body to another, nor phenomenal change of the body in the internal perception of souls, then what guarantees that the soul of Christ is really present in the wafer or the wine? In his correspondence with the Jesuit theologian Bartholomew de Bosses, which lasted from 1706 until his death and encompassed over 130 letters, Leibniz proposes one of his most controversial concepts, the vinculum substantiale monadum. That is, the chain, bond, or relation of monads which is in itself like a substance, or rather substantifying. Of course, the kind of immediate incorporeal change that occurs in transubstantiation, this is the ritual where the Eucharist literally becomes the body of Christ. Of course, the kind of immediate incorporeal change that occurs in transubstantiation is impossible in nature and therefore due to an unnatural act. God superadds a bond, which means that it remains exterior to the aggregate of which it guarantees the metaphysical unity, just like God remains exterior to the phenomenal series of the world, rather than its virtual relations to the world as a whole being inherent to a monad. Leibniz writes that this external bond is only adherent. That is external to its terms. It is a kind of viscous elastic by which the requisites of the bread are disconnected from the soul of the bread or wine and reattached to the soul of Christ. The bread or wine still look the same phenomenally, and their former requisite monads still find the source of their perceptions in themselves, but they now form part of a new mutual belonging of which the common cause is expressed most clearly by the monad of Christ. The compositions of the bread or the wine have been contaminated with a new essence. The Word becomes flesh. Doesn't this introduction of the substantial bond violate Leibniz's most important principle, which says that there are only monads, the only genuine entities, and the aggregate phenomena, abstractions, or relations which owe their existence to the mind only? Yet how could the world stay phenomenal in such an important matter? I believe that unless there are corporeal substances, bodies are transformed into phenomena. What does Leibniz believe? And is it really a question of belief, or rather one of efficacious being or operativity? To make things worse, on February the 15th, 1712, Leibniz suddenly tells Des Bosses that he sees the presence of Christ in the bread and wine as only a subspecies of the more general metaphysical problem of the union of mind and body, and changes the focus of his letters accordingly. If that substantial bond of monads were absent, then all bodies with all their qualities would be only well-founded phenomena, like a rainbow or an image in a mirror, in a word, continuous dreams that agree perfectly with one another, and in this alone would consist the reality of those phenomena. Therefore, if a body is a substance, it is the realization of phenomena going beyond their agreement. From aggregation to congregation, if there is a selection of possible worlds at the level of souls, there must also be a selection of possibilities at the level of bodies. No incarnation is possible without real bonds, which means that the reality or force of a bonding is determined gradually as a function of the distance from the dominated monad to the monads that it is dominating. Since substantiation is not coordinated from the outside by the monad that dominates an organic assemblage, however, inorganic assemblages are also possible. As in Bruno's magic or in law, bonds are not things but agencies that distort the terms they relate, insofar as these already include other thing-like relations. The operative function of bonds is to thicken or stiffen an organic whole within the flux of inorganic matter. Phenomena or extension must be substantiated, substantiatum, instead of transubstantiated. If incarnation implies that my body is not an emanation of substantial form, but real, constructed in the sense of being made to believe in, not made up, this also obliges us to conceive of a derivative sociality or new substantiality beyond monads. But if the vinculum is substance-like, then shouldn't we also conceive of substances as bond-like? The reality of a corporeal substance, the irreducible thisness of the phenomenal, is constituted by an exterior relation that accounts for the local cohesion of disparate substances. Over and above these real relations, that is, the global relations of duration, position, interaction internal to the intellect of God, a more perfect relation can be conceived through which a single new substance arises from many substances. And this will not be a simple result. That is, it will not consist in true or real relations alone, but moreover, it will add some new substantiality or substantial bond.
Again, this means that we must understand substance modally. I am thus, but so is my body. Composite substantiality is not a noun, but a gerund, a substantializing that does not persist outside a certain mode. Whatever exists besides monads and the modifications of monads is a consequence of making phenomena real. This is, moreover, what things look like when the medial structure of demand replaces substance as central concept of ontology. A mode is neither a modification of substance nor a reality in itself, but a resultant that modifies the forces from whence it comes through its demand for a new composite to be realized. Whether at the level of the individual or the trans-individual, to be is not to possess an essence, but a pre-individual summoning of the requisites necessary for its own individuation. There is no matter, but only a mattering in a certain manner, unified by a bond that demands, exigit, but does not necessarily imply, involve it, or essentially depend on, existence. We should emphasize the absolute yet medial nature of this process of making phenomena real. Being is a demand of modes just as modes are the demand of being. But this also means that we move from the problem of having a body to that of having a soul. How to substantialize the virtual. In demanding or desiring existence, the body that desires modifies itself, and thus constitutes its own being disposed in a certain way. Just like I am not the stroll itself, but become constituted as a finite subject of a specific kind by going for a stroll. A finite body does not realize itself, but is realized or rendered effective through a self-differing aptitude to inform matter in a certain way. Composition does not relate directly to individual bodies, but concerns their incorporeal modes of becoming, and the creative instaurative force that wants to appropriate these bodies. Contrary to the idea of a corporeal, and in the last instance spiritual, natural, fixed, and unchangeable substance to which we can attribute gestural or postural accidents, Vitruvian man, Christ on the cross, or in other words, contrary to a resolutely substantialist form of thought, justice obliges us to think a body, corpse, that could not exist without its manners of being, which could not consist except through its gestural and postural events, a corpus. Manner always precedes matter. There is no generic human body modeled on the unity of the soul, but only individual bodies constituted through various more or less human habits. The more classical equivalent term for this plastic power of the body is, of course, habit, hexis, habitus, which comes from the verb to have or to bind and describes how we have a hold, manière, on our existence in the form of modal dispositions or powers of behavior, virtues such as being knowledgeable, being an architect, being a flute player. Modes transform being into having, as if the former first of all signifies to have a certain way of being, to be disposed in a certain way. Nevertheless, what appears as innate disposition from the monadological point of view is acquired from the composite point of view. It is through contracting collective habits, the networks of our multiple attachments in which it is impossible to say who is the master, that our bodies get into shape and we are carried into being. Through experience in the passage of time, habit stabilizes the body like a second skin, and thereby turns it into the possession of the soul that contemplates it. Habit is second nature, as Aristotle says, and thus defies the boundaries between the natural and the counter-natural. Manner and existence, soul and body, cause and effect remain distinct, but at the level of their operativity they are articulated at their threshold of indiscernibility. But while the habitual bond adequately explains the metaphysical mystery of the conjunction of body and soul, this is no longer the case in the mystery of transubstantiation. Here we are dealing with, on the one hand, accidents without substance, the bodies of the bread and the wine, and, on the other hand, a substance without accident, the soul of Christ. As Agamben points out, their disjunction destitutes the socio-juridical ownership of bodies among the constituent souls. The adequate word is no longer being or having, but the simple disjunctive synthesis of and. What replaces the normal mediation of dominance and slavery through ownership is a more direct contact articulating a new corporeal potential. The inoperativity of habit activates a use of bodies that is no longer private or public but common. From the hiatus between the subject and its possessions there emerges a mode of shared presence that is both active and passive, and that can only be articulated in the middle voice. It is here that we must localize the magical efficacy of the Catholic priest, whose role is that of animate instrument in the office he carries out. In using his own body to be used by others in an operation whose principal agent is Christ, the celebrant is both cause and effect. He conducts a work and attests that something meaningful is happening, but as someone whose state must be resisted and transformed by further proofs of celebration in order to be effective. As singular possibility or real potentiality, the work is not the subject but a shared sensible immediacy that functions as a principle of conservation and that demands our fidelity. In preserving in existence, it becomes the suppositum of a composite individuating self, even when this is not a classical substantial form, but an impersonal mode of affectability, and exact yet rigorous, that remains inextricably interwoven with all the things that relay it in their own way. The repetition of change, the putting to work of the sacrament in a self conditioning ritual that produces a change in perception, is the sole consistency or reason for what exists only in the mode of collective effervescence and otherwise remains neither ill founded nor well founded, but unfounded. In grace, when passion becomes unblocked collective action, as Michel Guerin writes, our gestures become a physical version of belief.
This staying with the joy and trouble of a differential and distributed repetition is further elaborated in Leibniz's last letter to Desposis, which he passes following Ovid's metamorphosis from the narcissistic register of optics to the more psychotic register of acoustics. While individual monads are conceived as anaphobic mirrors that immediately, at the speed of light, agree in their reflection of the world as a whole, composite bodies are crowds unified by an originary echo. Since the binding of substance is acknowledged as a mode of creativity, that does not result from a substance, both individual monads and the corporeal mixtures can be a source of modifications, in the sense of active potential, as long as each is allocated its own level or domain. Mirrors offer a strictly private image of the public world, but echoes are irreducibly trans-individual and travel at the much slower speed of sound. Instead of creating a new perception or representation which presupposes a relation eternal to the soul, an originary echo consists as the social reproduction or recursivity of the phenomenal, that is, its redoubling propagation in relation to other souls and their attendant circumstances over a lapse of time. This is what we have called Mannerist secondness, a kind of relational buffering that allows for attunement, constantly reconnecting what it separates. What appears to be a loss of individuality is really a gain in communication, an intimacy that acts as new mode of entailment beyond the degree zero of sufficient reason, that is efficient causality. To be is to be part of a sensuous correspondence, to be grounded in a communism of modes, to undergo the ordeal of becoming other without leaving oneself behind. An echo of a global harmony, a corporeal manner, is its fine exemplification and material incarnation. Leibniz reassures the bosses, to whom he also apologizes for writing in fits and starts. The principles of freedom are Protestant, but the law of nature is the Catholic religion. What better way is there to say that Leibniz's philosophy not only proceeds through conjunctions but also include disjunctions? Following Deleuze, we could say that contrary to the Neoplatonic world consisting of an infinite number of floors with a stairway that descends and ascends, and despite the infinite hierarchy of modes, the Leibnizian world has two floors, the pleats of matter and the folds of the soul, and is compelled to constantly oscillate between them. What passes between them and genetically accounts for both are the manners, which modify under two aspects of expression, perceptions and appreciations on the one hand, and bodies on the other hand. They are virtualities that do not exist outside of their actualization in individual action, just as they are possibles that do not exist outside of their realization in material reaction. Under both aspects, essence and existence, ideality and texture become indiscernible in the event as assemble of operations. Dewey will later affirm that mind and matter are primarily verbs. What differentiates them is their inflection. Reminiscent of Sorarius' distinction between existence and being, the real or genetic distinction between souls and bodies is that between manner and matter, between the power of activating something, presence, and the power of being affected by something, realization, collective ensembles and machinic bodies. There is nothing idealist about the presence of a manner, since it does not refer to an ideal substance, but to a non-specific ensemble, an open multiplicity. Like a conatus, manner is intransitive and generic, a force yet aimless and without object. It becomes directed only in an encounter when it gets modified. With Deleuze, we can relate Leibniz's Mannerism to the Stoic theory of incorporeals. Like the speech act, "This is my body," an immaterial gesture through which language makes the material world crystallize according to a purely virtual sense. We must conceive of manner as immaterial transformation of a body, an occasion that never stops happening and never ceases to await being incarnated by all individuals. Hence the technical meaning of the credo I second. That participate in it. With Soriot, we can also describe the Eucharist as an instaurative occurrence in which the monads of the bread or the wine, the call of the priest and all other souls present begin to resonate in a responsive form, one to the other, forming a couple. What replaces the resemblance in the mirror is a decentering clamor of affirmations, a real passion that is simultaneously a reason, in the sense that the reason is the relation, or law of response to an appeal that is higher and more real and perhaps more spiritual and moral, while also being physical and corporeal. It is an experience of conversation that does not need proof, but that demands to be heard and amplified through so many asymmetric becomings, that only in the ensemble can lead to the moment wherein the spiritual unify of existence conferred upon Christ becomes second, i.e., socially reflected and publicly incarnated, nature. In secondness, the reality of the social is the sociality of the real. What Mannerism reveals is a structural analogy between bodies and language, in which a body language replaces the classic distribution of words and things. When we say, I love you, this is not a judgment either of myself or of you. I do not represent a private emotion, but gesture into being a communal state of affairs divided over an becomings. As a speech act, it may have the form of a bond, but it has no other content than the production of this bond itself. Instead of acting directly on you over whom I claim ownership, I create an intermediate zone of belonging. Here, too, incarnation does not mean incorporation, but a existential eventuality that each corresponding body is involved in accepting to its own requirements for participation. Is it sayable? Does the other accept this possible promise or obligation? Does it enable a belonging in becoming? More generally, this is why, just as we shouldn't confuse the ontic and the existential, it is necessary to distinguish between totalities and sure existence. Composites between soul and body, word and flesh, subject and object, are of the latter type. A discourse is not a consistent embodiment or enactment, but an activation of a mode of bodying or compositioning, of which the coherence is constantly put to the test. Does it still hold or not? Does it effectively come to pass? Does it make sense? Trade explains how the mimetic diffusing of an invention, such as a word, is always a question of mutual possession, i.e., of desire and belief, categories that, in turn, correspond to what Leibniz calls appreciation and perception. At once substantive and originary, things and relation, force and structure, an echo works in two directions at once, from the possessor to the possessed, and from the possessed to the possessor, or from the original to the copy, and vice versa. The same goes for knowledge. In the double movement of manner and matter, there is no general standpoint, only situated modes of knowing and the non-innocence of their effects. The speech act binds in the form of what Simondon calls a transduction, an internal structuration of the tensions of a system without any loss of information. Neither top-down nor bottom-up, it is the activation of a potential relation that is immediately divided in its circular concretization, insofar as each body envelops and individuates the intensities of being differently.
So there was a couple things in this last reading that I thought was interesting. One was that quote, God super adds a bond, which means that it remains exterior to the aggregate of which it guarantees of the metaphysical unity, just like God remains exterior to the phenomenal series of the world. And I thought it touched on what Sejord brought up in our October 7th reading on how God plays second fiddle to existence. And I've been thinking about that in terms of that question, can God create a boulder so big he himself can't lift it? And there was a really interesting answer that Emily in Montreal once said to this question. Yes, God already has. It's free will. That basically God gives humans free will, and that is something that even God cannot impinge or infringe upon.
That's actually interesting. I don't know how I feel about that. My initial reaction was like, what? That's ridiculous. And now I'm like, wait a second. It reminds me of Kierkegaard. In my opinion, the only way forward into this stuff is not necessarily through, because we're going to go through it anyway. It's more that by giving up these notions, will we be able to know the answer? Like very Kierkegaardian, like what he was talking about throughout Fear and Trembling, or was it the other one? I can't remember which one it was where he talks about that. But the whole notion to me is that free will, the only way we ever have free will is if we give up the notion of ever trying to act freely and we give into, Kierkegaard talked about, like we give into God. And by doing so, we become free and we become liberated and we have access to this free will. In this regard, the question of whether or not this boulder could ever be made is superfluous. It's a waste of our time because God's will isn't our will. And even if God made us have will, our will is still in line with God's will because God designed us. So, in that mystic sense, in order to tap into the sacred, we have to forego what we would see as our will, which will then become God's will. So, if this boulder notion's true, then from where I'm sitting, where it's like, is free will, then it also isn't a problem because if our free will is that boulder, it's already being lifted by us for God.
Yeah, that notion of foregoing free will reminds me of another way that I was thinking about this is when people get really annoyed with the idea of God because they say, well, if God exists, then why is there suffering in the world? Why is cancer a thing? Or even why is there murder? And the way that we can think about this now of if God gives you free will, that he won't infringe upon, it is a liberating thing. If God was always entering into human society to force people to not act in certain ways, that would be extremely authoritarian. That would be almost infinitely more violent than just the fact that murders occur. And another way we could think about this is if God allows for murder to happen, well, under this notion that we're granted free will with no limits, then we're equally capable of not murdering. We're equally capable of creating circumstances where murder is mitigated, or potentially even where murder just doesn't happen anymore. And that's all without a all-knowing, benevolent dictator.
I get you. That makes sense. It's more in line with some of the more modern humanist thinking when it comes to free will. But like something about the whole negation of free will actually liberating somebody has always stuck with me since I first encountered it in Kierkegaard.
So there is this one kind of interesting one. The repetition of change, the putting to work of the sacrament in a self-conditioning ritual that produces a change in perception, is the sole consistency or reason for what exists only in the mode of collective effervescence, and otherwise remains neither ill-founded nor well-founded, but unfounded, contingent. In grace, when passion becomes unblocked collective action, as Michel Guerin writes, our gestures become a physical version of belief. And since seeing the title Collective Effervescence, I thought of the Squeeze Case Eternal scene, but then I got to this passage and really thought of that scene. And the Squeeze Case Eternal scene is that passage from Moby Dick where they're squeezing spermaceti, which at that time was thought to be whale sperm. And Ishmael, quote, unknowingly, end quote, holds another crew member's hand, like a male crew member's hand. But the passage goes, For now, since by many prolonged, repeated experiences I have perceived that in all cases man must eventually lower, or at least shift, his conceit of attainable felicity, not placing it anywhere in the intellect or the fancy, but in the wife, the heart, the bed, the table, the saddle, the fireside, the country. Now that I have perceived all this, I am ready to squeeze case eternally. In thoughts of the visions of the night, I saw long rows of angels in paradise, each with his hands in a jar of spermaceti. And there's this one thinker in their peer reviewed article who asks, like, this is kind of a weird scene. He just came from this extremely queer experience with other men, and now Ishmael is placing happiness in a heterosexual marriage. And we can think of it in terms of religious ideas of finding happiness in the mundane. But as this writer brings up, it's not necessarily heterosexual marriage, because all throughout the book, Ishmael and Queequeg are treated like married couples.
Weren't they even mateys? I can't remember. It's been a while since I read it.
In the very beginning, when Ishmael and Queequeg first sleep together, Ishmael wakes up the next morning and Queequeg has his arm and leg draped over him, and it's described as a wedding clasp.
Okay, I just didn't know. I couldn't remember if it was ever official, like they put it on the records, because it has been a long since I read that book. But Matalog, like where the term matey comes from, was related to basically being married on the seas. It's largely for property's sake. Some people argue because they try not to read into it too much. But I couldn't remember if it actually was more formalized. I know what you're talking about. I remember the scene you're talking about, but I couldn't remember if there's anything more formally recognized in some sort of documentation at some point, like when they're talking about setting off or when they're at port.
I could look into it, but I'm really not sure. I do know that when Melville pushed the book to Britain, I don't know if he edited it or if the editors cut it out, but a lot of the homosexual stuff was taken out to basically clear British censors, but was kept in for the American publication. And
we've usually had better track record with that kind of stuff. But at the same time, sometimes we have the opposite true. Sometimes movies are overly edited here when they wouldn't be elsewhere. It's weird.
yeah, and we could compare it to
There were
Oscar
two big
Wilde.
court cases around the same time. One was D.H. Lawrence and obscenity trial, and the other one was Allen Ginsberg's Howl, and then followed by William Burroughs. Both in the 60s, I think. And then after that, it was basically a free-for-all.
It's so wild to think about, too, that that book came from the U.S. It doesn't have that feel. And it has a feel of much older literature. It really probably is like the greatest American novel.
Howl Obscenity Trial, 1957.
That's when that happened? It's 57?
D.H. Lawrence, 1959, Lady Chatterley's Lover.
I was going to say, didn't even, what was the Howe guy? Ginsberg. He had a one too, didn't
he? Yeah, 57.
Okay.
And then 59, the D.H. Lawrence one in the United Kingdom. And then 1965, William Burroughs with Naked Lunch.
Naked Lunch is great, though. But I like where you're going with this, Brad. I would have, in another life or another time, I probably would have done well in communications or literature. I just was more confused by people. That's why I got into anthropology. But like, I, ironically enough, focused more on the humanities side of things. So
I feel it.
Actually, those things were in the back of my mind today because they were talking about how Before you came on, Andrew, we were talking slightly about Walter Benjamin and some of his. I didn't mention it, but I was reading a text on him and architecture and how he basically applied montage technique to the way he's writing, and then shortly after, like Burroughs does that with text, like he used the cut up. But Benjamin was way before the others, thinking about things, conceptualizing things as a montage. He might be the first thinker to do that.
That's interesting. Well, the first one to like write it down in a formal way. Because I'm sure there's been people who have thought that way, but not necessarily whoever put pen to paper about it.
Yeah, but they didn't have the awareness of it. He had the awareness of what he was saying.
I get what you're talking about. Yeah, because like I've even heard Temple Grandin has some actually really neat stuff with like similar descriptions of thought that have always rung true with me, where she talks about like word webs in her head. Kind of was neat. I know what you're talking about, though.
And the way we think about things, the way we conceptualize things, we think about them in like frames and webs in our minds, the way we categorize and recall things. And then in this text, what we've just read today, there's a really interesting thing where he mentions the optic and the auditory.
I think I actually came in towards the end of that because there was the reflection on like matter and manner, and I was like, "This is fucking dope." Like I was just like, "Yes," because I get what you're talking about, and being autistic, one of the things that tends to get me in trouble socially is the way I bank on that categorical thinking.
Oh,
Like
one of the things in Kafka on the Shore, at the end of the book, when he takes the painting away, Oshima says to Kafka, look at the painting and listen to the wind, like it's sight and sound. And then there are two of the things, like the first things in the Bible that God creates, it's vision and light. Let there be light. There's light and then there's sound. And then in this text that we're just reading, he talks about optic and auditory, the two. And we were talking about how Benjamin said his sight, his vision wasn't that good. And when he would walk around and look at things, he said, I would only take in like 1/7 of what a normal person would take in. And he was much more of an auditory person. And he would then write in a kind of auditory way. It may be that people who don't have such a good vision write in a certain way that is more pleasing to the ear. Anyway, where is that part?
You're probably referencing this. This staying with the joy and trouble of a differential and distributed repetition is further elaborated in Leibniz's last letters to De Bossis, when he passes, following Ovid's Metamorphosis, from the narcissistic register of optics to the more psychotic register of acoustics. While individual monads are conceived of anamorphic mirrors that immediately at the speed of light agree in their reflection of the world as a whole, composite bodies are crowds unified by an originary echo. And immediately, going back to Moby Dick again, I couldn't help but think of the doubloon scene when Ahab interprets everything as just reflections of himself. When Ahab goes, quote, the firm tower, that is Ahab. The volcano, that is Ahab. The courageous, the undaunted, and victorious fowl, that too is Ahab. All are Ahab, and this round gold is but the image of the rounder globe, which like a magician's glass.
You know how in Mannerism all the faces are reflected and repeated? If you think about all the characters looking at the doubloon, and there's all these different faces around it, like of all the crew members.
Vertumnus is supposed to be some sovereign king.
It's Leopold II.
I think you're right. I think it is. It's probably Leopold II. But yeah, there's that which, like a magician's glass, to each and every man in turn, but mirrors back his own mysterious self. I think the quote that you were thinking of is the one that comes after this from Sejord. Mirrors offer a strictly private image of the public world, but echoes are irreducibly trans individual and travel at the much slower speed of sound. Instead of creating a new perception or representation, which presupposes a relation internal to the soul, an originary echo consists as the social reproduction or recursivity of the phenomenal, that is, its redoubling propagation in relation to other souls and their attendant circumstances over a lapse of time. And there's even this one. An echo works in two directions at once, from the possessor to the possessed, and from the possessed to the possessor, or from the original to the copy and vice versa. And it had me thinking, are there really any echoes in Moby Dick? There are echoes. I haven't analyzed them yet, so I won't really get into the literal echoes that happen. But it made me think that outside of the literal echoes in the book, there are echoes of previous traditions and of characters resembling one another, which gets at what you were just saying about the mirroring that goes on in Mannerist paintings. In Moby Dick, there's a lot of references to biblical tradition or European tradition or Greek tradition, and they're exhausted to basically create an authentic American genre. Or Ishmael reflects Ahab in one way, and Ahab reflects Starbuck in another way, and Starbuck reflects Ahab, and that sort of thing that goes on.
If you think of the painting of Las Meninas, where the sovereign brings everyone else in the room into being, it's the doubloon that brings all the other faces, all the other people into being, and they're all rotating around it. It is mannerism in that text.
And it decenters the human subject. Las Meninas decenters
Yes.
the human subject, and the gold doubloon decenters
They're all
the human.
decentered around capital, and that, my friends, is literary criticism.
They've been alienated.
Ouch.
When I saw Collective Effervescence too, it made me think of the Squeeze Case Eternal scene because of Adam Lovas's object-oriented literary studies and Melville's Cosmos writing as dissemination in Moby Dick. On page 71, Lovas writes, all forms can be held against all other forms. Anything can appear with the contexture of bubbling, frothy, oceanic, pure liquidity. It really makes you think of like effervescence. On the topic of echo, there is the one quote when Sir George says, what appears to be a loss of individuality is really a gain in communion, an intimacy that acts as new mode of entailment beyond the degree zero of reason that is efficient causality. To be is to be part of a sensuous correspondence, to be grounded in a communism of modes, to undergo the ordeal of becoming other without leaving oneself behind, an echo of a global harmony. A corporeal manner is its finite exemplification of material incarnation. And it made me think of a contrast to Ahab's narcissism of seeing himself in everything is really Ishmael's loss of self and gain of community in his intimacy with Queequeg.
And he also loses Queequeg, and Queequeg sacrifices himself to save him.
which I don't know if it was Sajor that said this or if it was an Instagram post. I think it might have been an Instagram post. And it was basically talking about every meeting is an eventual departing. Every single person that we meet along this journey of life, we're going to have to say goodbye to at some point, whether it's because the relationship just fails or whether it's because somebody dies. So, yeah, that's all the stuff that I had to talk about from this chapter, though.
You could also think about the Catholic Mass. The round communion wafer, like a doubloon, is the thing that brings the communion into being. All these people circulating around this one round thing. And it's a bit like the sun in a way. The world and the planets circulating around the sun, brought into being by it.